Today's episode has been brought to you by Schedulicity. Welcome to episode 32 of the Connected Yoga Teacher podcast with today's guest, Kathryn Bruni-Young, founder of the Mindful Strength Center. This week, a fellow yoga teacher shared how great it was to have time to chat in our consultation call. She expressed how just this time carved out to chat with a fellow yoga teacher for a full hour, how much that meant. Just taking a look at her business, talking things through, and she said that she really missed that since leaving her yoga teacher training. I get it, yoga wonders. I know how isolating it can feel to be in the wilderness of yoga entrepreneurship. The Connected Yoga Teacher was created for you, the yoga entrepreneur, so that every week you can have access to knowledge, inspiration, and a supportive community. About that supportive community, if you have not yet joined our private Facebook group for yoga teachers, head on over to our website. It's at theconnectedyogateacher.com, and you'll see a join button right on our homepage. This is a super supportive community of yoga teachers. Just today, I shared a post asking yoga teachers just to share something that's challenging. No trying to fix it for each other, just lay it out there what's kind of going on. We weren't offering advice, we were just holding space for each other, and some personal stuff in there and some yoga business stuff and overall general life stuff. So just know that there is a supportive community out there for you as a yoga teacher, and it's a community that really understands the challenges that you face, and we'd love to have you there. And for those who are already there, thank you so much for jumping in there and commenting. We also had a thread going on in there about your favorite yoga resource book, and I can't wait to actually take this list and start ordering some books from my local library. I'm a big library fan. When I love a book enough, then I buy it. So when I buy a book, it's a really big investment for me. Otherwise, I just like to order them from the library. Yep, I'm frugal. That's the way I am. Before we dive into today's episode with Kathryn Bruni-Young about adding strengthening to your yoga practice or the yoga that you're sharing, let's hear from Hillary of Schedulicity, our podcast sponsor.
Hello, Connected Yoga Teachers. This is Hillary from Schedulicity with the hot tip of the week. Flex your business muscles with Schedulicity. We make it easy to expand as you grow. If you add a new teacher or front desk staff, you can give them their own class schedules and unique logins. You can also add new classes or workshops as you advance your expertise. Increase your clientele when new students find you through the Schedulicity marketplace, and keep track of them by adding photos or notes to their client profiles. You can even add the multiple location management add-on when you're ready to open a second, third, or 20th location. Successful businesses grow, and Schedulicity knows you need tools that are as strong and flexible as your practice.
Thank you for that, Hillary. For those of you who don't know, I am a huge fan of Schedulicity. I've used it myself since 2011, and it is the scheduling software that I use for the podcasts, for my private yoga classes, and for all of the consultation calls that I do. I wanted to share a little story with you guys about my own journey of strengthening and adding that into my existing yoga practice. It was through working with Barb Elias, who is one of my coaches, a mentor of mine, a great friend of mine, and a fellow yoga teacher. And thanks to Barb, because I would not have done this otherwise, I added in a strength practice for my morning, what used to be just my yoga practice. And the reason why was because Barb knew that I was really struggling to set aside this time to do my yoga practice, to even go to a class or set aside time to do it in my own home studio. And what was happening was I couldn't be in the student brain. I couldn't just have the student brain. I was really moving into just teacher brain, wanting to write things down, wanting to remember things. And it was Barb who got me to do this strength practice. It was also Miranda, who's a local personal trainer. And I will have to say that I did not enjoy it at all. It was not my idea. And they were both like, yeah, we can do this together. But it made such a difference in the way I was feeling, and it rippled out into my world. So as you guys already know, when you do a yoga practice, it has effects off the mat. And finding a strengthening practice really also did this for me. Fast forward to when I spoke with Kathryn Bruni-Young, I was super excited to find a yoga teacher who was really stepping into this. And Kathryn grew up practicing yoga with her mother. Some of you might know her, Diane Bruni. Kathryn then went on to teach yoga in Toronto for 10 years, and she experienced her own yoga injury. Kathryn worked then with personal trainers, some physiotherapists, and then other experts from different modalities, different movement practices. And this is what informed her own teaching style. She's the founder of the Mindful Strength Center, which is formerly known as the Cornwall Yoga Studio. What's pretty neat in this interview is that it was done a little while ago. So when I talked with Kathryn, her studio was called the Cornwall Yoga Studio, and she was kind of sitting on the fence of what she was going to call herself and her space. So now it's the Mindful Strength Center, and it's formally known as the Cornwall Yoga Studio. Kathryn developed this type of movement, which she calls mindful strength, where she blends strength with mobility and mindfulness. I love this piece, and you're going to get to hear her describe that. Kathryn has led teacher trainings, online courses, and workshops all over Canada and Europe. She describes herself as a mover, an educator, and a creator. In her own words, she says, "I'm passionate about helping people develop strength and mobility while regaining confidence in their bodies. Mindful strength is the combination of sensitivity and power, and through movement, we can reach our highest potential." In Kathryn's own words, she says, "I am passionate about helping people develop strength and mobility while regaining confidence in their bodies. Mindful strength is the combination of sensitivity and power, and through movement, we can reach our highest potential." Alrighty, so let's dive in and hear from Kathryn Bruni-Young. Welcome, Kathryn. So great to have you today on the podcast. I'm really excited because this is a topic that I feel like I need a lot of help with, strength training in yoga for my own practice and in my classes. So welcome.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for having me.
Tell me, what got you started on this yoga journey or on this strength training journey?
My yoga journey started when I was a little kid. So my mom was a yoga teacher, and she owned one of the biggest first studios in downtown Toronto. And that's really how I got started on the yoga journey. Just started practicing with her, and we used to go to all different types of workshops and training programs together. And then I practiced kind of Ashtanga yoga for a number of years pretty intensely with my mom. And then what started to happen was I started to feel a little bit injured in my body. And it really started off like just a little bit at a time, like maybe a little ache, a little pain here or there, nothing too major. And then over the course of the next couple of years, I kept on doing my, vigorous Ashtanga practice. And by the time I was about 22, 23 years old, I realized that I had some pretty significant repetitive strain injuries. That's what really brought me to the strength practice, just realizing that, okay, something is not right in my body. Whatever I'm doing might have to change a little bit. And really just starting to research, like, what were the other options out there, which until that point I had not really done yet. So over the course of that preliminary research, just friends of mine and people that I knew would kind of randomly send me to a workshop here, a class there. And that's really how I found strength training. Just, really by chance. I went to a workshop, a weekend seminar at a gym, and just totally fell in love with it. It made a lot of sense for me. So that's really how it all began for me.
Well, I really appreciate you sharing that journey. I've been, watching your videos on Facebook and things that you post, and it makes a lot of sense. The message seems really in line with how I'm feeling as a yoga teacher. Sometimes I feel like the emphasis in yoga has really switched to be so much about flexibility. And I feel like even in my own body, I've gone to my body worker and she's just said, you need to build in a little more strength training and less flexibility. So can you tell us why you feel this is so important? And obviously in your own story and now what you're seeing, what it is that you teach in terms of how can strength training help yoga practitioners?
In my own practice and in my own body, my yoga practice was always kind of geared towards strength in some way or another. Like I was very interested in handstands and with arm balancing and these very vigorous, strong poses. But it wasn't really enough. And it wasn't enough of a balance for my body to actually thrive. So while I was practicing yoga, some parts of my body were incredibly strong. Like my upper body strength was great, but other parts were not getting what they needed. So when I started doing strength training, I started to really realize wow, there's these certain parts of my body that are really weak, that just are not used to being under this load on a regular basis. And that really started to show up in my daily life. When I started to train, there was a little bit of a period where I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure if these movements were a good thing for me to do. When you have, repetitive chronic pain in your body happening for years at a time, anything that kind of taxes those parts of the body is going to be a little bit frightening. And that's how I felt in the early stages. I was having back pain and knee pain, and then I was seeing my personal trainer, and he was getting me to do, back and knee exercises. And it was very challenging for me in the early stages to believe that these movements were going to help make me better. And then over the course of a few months, I stuck with it. And I realized just how much those strengthening movements were making my body feel better. And once I started to see just a little bit of that improvement, I realized, wow, there is a whole world out here. And, if these things are helping me, maybe they're going to help my students. And that's when I really started to focus more on strength in my teaching. And I think strength training is so important for yoga just to really balance it all out. And like I said, there were some parts of my body doing yoga that were very strong. Like I could do push-ups really well. I could do a handstand relatively well. If I had a pull-up bar that I was hanging on, I had no strength in that direction. And that's a big chunk. That's a big chunk of the upper body that's used for pulling. And I realized that was inexistent in my body. I think that strength training just helps us to balance out all these little parts that might not get as addressed with yoga. And I love the yoga practice. I have a yoga studio myself. We teach some of these poses, but I think that yoga as a physical exercise program is not the most well-rounded, balanced out thing. Nor do I think anything is the perfect balanced out fit. I look at people who have been lifting weights and only lifting weights for their entire lives. I don't think that those people are balanced at all. So I think that strength training is the perfect cross training for yoga. It doesn't have to be one or the other. I think in the ideal world, it could be both.
Oh, that's so good that it complements it. I think sometimes when this conversation comes up, I feel it in myself, like this rise of a defensiveness of yoga. And maybe it's because I'm so invested in yoga as a yoga teacher. But then I think it's so good to look at, you wouldn't just go see your doctor if you needed your teeth looked at, like you would go to your dentist.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
That's good.
Yeah.
It's good to know.
And I think it's also really important in this kind of remodeling and restructuring of the yoga practice in our modern Western world. I think it's important to have that attitude, that complementary attitude, because I think a lot of people are in love with the yoga practice because it's done something really good for them. And so we have a little bit of an attachment to this practice because it has made some positive change in our life. And I think that if we totally disregard that, we're going to lose a lot of people along the way. And it's definitely not to say that this practice is wrong. I just think it needs to be kind of complemented with something else, like everything does.
That's so good. And also, you learned through your own experience in your own body, and you sharing that story with others helps for sure. Now, when you said that using a pull-up bar, my kids were making fun of me the other day because I was outside and they're like, you can't even climb a tree. And I was thinking of your videos and different videos that I'm seeing around strength training and thinking, no, and how would I build that? And to be quite honest, I'm terrified of the gym. Like just walking, I had to walk through a gym at one point to teach a yoga class, and I was just kind of shying away from everything and then trying to get to the back of the yoga studio. So do you have some tips around, like, do you think that everyone should be going to the gym?
I think so. Gyms are hard. I mean, at this point in my life, whenever I'm traveling, I'm teaching a workshop here or there, wherever I am, I always go to the gym, and that's where I do my practice, whatever type of practice it is. But gyms are hard. It's a bit of a rough setting sometimes. And for people who have any type of like sensory sensitivity, I think that the gym is hard. There's oftentimes lots of sounds. There's like people, doing very aggressive things. So I completely understand the not wanting to go to the gym. At the same time, there are so many different types of facilities, so many different types of gyms, everything from, group training, which is usually a bit of a nicer environment, to like the big box gym where people are sometimes a little bit intimidated. I think that going to the gym is helpful in that there's all this equipment at the gym that, I think we should be using, like a pull-up bar, like a barbell, like some weights to lift up off the floor. Having that equipment available makes a huge difference in what you are able to do, to what's accessible to you. That being said, if people, maybe live in a place where there isn't a great gym to go to, or it becomes a financial issue of like, okay, I've got my yoga membership, now I need a gym membership, like this is just too much. I think that we don't necessarily have to go to the gym. There are things that you can do at home using simple things in your house to recreate the strength training environment. But there's a couple things that are really hard to recreate. Like you said, the pull-up bar, the idea of being able to climb up a tree, climb something, use all of those muscles in our upper bodies, that's hard to recreate without any equipment. So when I was in the early stages of strength training, I was not keen on going to the gym 3 or 4 days a week. Like I just wanted to go to my yoga studio because that's where I felt the best. That's where I felt comfortable. And so I got a pull-up bar and I just put it up in my kitchen in the doorway. And my brother and I were sharing an apartment at that time. And basically every time we walked through the doorway, we hung from the bar. And then he eventually learned how to do chin-ups. I eventually learned how to do chin-ups. And we did it at home and just together. But there's a couple things that having a little bit of equipment will make a really big difference. And that's when going to the gym is really helpful because the equipment is there and it can be really helpful.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So what are some of the things then that we could recreate at home?
Some exercises, some movements, like almost every day I try to post an exercise or a little routine on my Instagram page. And a lot of those movements, we don't need any props or apparatus at all. So I really like to start people, especially if they're new to strength training, I like to start with just really small, somewhat isolated body weight exercises. So different types of glute hamstring strengthening exercises, different types of hip bridges, the types of things you might find even in a Pilates class. I pull a lot of those exercises and insert them into my own strength training practice. And then if people are already familiar with those types of movements, if you have a set of stairs where you're living, you can do some calf raises, some heel raises on your stairs. There's an exercise called a step up, where if anybody Googles that, you'll find what it is. And you can do step ups on your stairs at home. Even sometimes something as simple as like using your countertop or using the side of your bed, the side of your couch. Push-ups are a movement that I'm a big advocate for, but push-ups are really hard. And to be able to do 5 or 10 push-ups on the floor is not realistic for most people. So, using the side of your bed or the side of your countertop as an incline to do push-ups on is a really nice way that you can work on that strength at home using just what you have.
Oh, what a great idea.
And then there's all these types of, micro movement exercises, lots of things that we can do for the rotator cuff, for the smaller muscles of the shoulders, smaller muscles of the upper back, where if people are practicing at home, I oftentimes just tell them to get a bottle of olive oil and just use that weight to do some exercises with. When we think about strength training, it doesn't have to be this like lifting hundreds of pounds thing. You could just be lifting 5 pounds, 10 pounds. And most of us have items like that around our house.
Right. And that's when it's really important, because it's, you often hear yoga students come to class and they say like, I just did this thing. I just lifted this thing and kind of turned. And that's when everything went sour. And so those are the muscles that need to be strengthened.
Yeah.
So when you teach classes, what do you define yourself as now? Do you still define yourself as a yoga teacher?
It's so hard. I mean, on the one hand, it kind of depends who I'm talking to.
Yeah.
I've identified for so long as a yoga teacher. I reached out to a fellow teacher a few days ago, and I sent her an email, and I was just introducing myself, and I was like, I'm like kind of a yoga teacher. It's hard for me to define myself at this point, because when I teach at my studio and when I teach my workshops, I teach very little yoga poses. Like, we don't do a lot of poses anymore at this point. But I still feel in some way I'm a yoga teacher just based on the experience that I'm providing my students with, which to me feels like a yoga class, and to them feels like a yoga class in the actual experience. However, the content is not what you would find in the typical yoga class. So sometimes I tell people I'm a movement teacher. Sometimes I tell people I'm a strength teacher. Kind of depends. Depends where I am. Sometimes people hear the word yoga teacher and they're either like really intrigued or they just totally write you off in like the first 10 seconds. And so, it kind of depends. I like to float around a little bit.
I like that, to be fluid with it. And also, if you look back into ancient yogic texts, there were no defined movements then either. So
yeah,
I would feel, and now I'm wishing I was a little closer to your studio, like, okay, let's give this a try. Like strength training with the flavor of a yoga class, I would feel really comfortable walking into something like that. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned rotator cuff, and you piqued my interest just because through repetitive chaturangas, basically, I feel like that's what it was in my own body. I ended up with a rotator cuff injury and was really ready to kind of throw yoga out the window for a while. Had to anyway, physically. So do you see that often? And then what would you suggest for someone who said, I'm even thinking of another student, like if they really ramp up their yoga practice like I did and then end up in an injury, you said that strength training can be helpful for this. Do you want to get into that a little bit more?
Yeah. So rotator cuff injury is so common. This is not like, yes, I've seen it frequently in yoga, but I see it frequently across the board. The rotator cuff is one of, I think, the most common injuries, through all sport and movement, and also people who are sedentary. So it's a big thing. I think that, the physiotherapy for a rotator cuff injury typically works pretty well. And I always recommend if somebody, has an injury, that the first thing they do is they go see a physiotherapist just to rule any potential things out. So if something has actually been ruptured, if there's some type of nerve damage, I think it's really good for people to have a little bit of that information before they start moving forwards. But at the same time, there's tons of things we can do. Just, moving the arm, not necessarily under load all the time. So working on different types of joint articulations, arm circles, shoulder circles, and then addressing some of the rotator cuff muscles. And sometimes that can be done as easily as just rotating the arm in the shoulder joint. I posted a video on Instagram a couple weeks ago where basically I'm sitting, I've got my palms turned up, I've got a block resting on my palm with the elbow bent.
Oh, yeah.
And I just kind of take the block out to the side, kind of like you're serving a pizza, as the students in my class joked around about. And we just did that a few times, and just kind of getting those nice little muscles right in the back of the shoulder that are holding the arm and the shoulder joint together to wake up a little bit. And also looking at all the other things. So yes, lots of people have a rotator cuff injury, but nothing is working in a vacuum. It's like, well, why are these injuries so prevalent? And, especially in a movement like a push-up or chaturanga, I think that a lack of strength in all of the other muscles around the shoulder is a big reason as to why that pose gives us that rotator cuff pain, or sometimes people get like shoulder impingement from it. I think that if the serratus muscles were strong enough, if there was enough pulling strength, like lat strength, lower traps, pec strength, I think that the rotator cuff injuries would start to decrease. So I think it has to be both. I think it's looking at these rotator cuff muscles and finding little exercises to do for them, but at the same time, addressing, the bigger muscles around the shoulder and addressing those imbalances.
Right. Oh, that's so helpful. We'll definitely put a link to your Instagram. I've been following you a bit more on Facebook, but are you on Instagram more than, you said you're posting daily?
Yeah, almost daily. I mean, all of those posts then get pushed to Facebook. So I think if you're on one or the other, it's kind of the same thing.
Awesome.
But yeah, it's basically the Instagram is like an archive of like hundreds of exercises. And I even like scroll back through my own Instagram page to be like, what was I doing 6 months ago? Because there's exercises that you forget about after you haven't done them in a little while.
Oh, that's so cool. And that's a good tip for teachers as well, whether they were offering strength training or whether they're offering something completely different. That's great.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I love that you said go to a physiotherapist. On another podcast episode, we're going to hear from a physiotherapist who's also a yoga teacher, Ariel, and I think that's such an important message to not try and be the only person. So we already said that it's a complementary practice, and to then give students the chance to find that complementary practice. So thanks for that.
Yeah, I think that's really important.
So why, you were telling me that you really feel like strength training is helpful for repetitive strain. Why do you feel like that?
Well, I think repetitive strain in the yoga setting, strength training can be really helpful. I think that it's really just because, from what I've seen, at least in my own experiences with my students and myself, a lot of the repetitive strain injuries that are coming up are, due to some type of obviously repetitive recurring movement. And oftentimes, from what I can tell, it's based on some type of stretching or overstretching. So, the pain people will have in their hamstring when they bend over, that type of repetitive injury, the lower back stuff that starts to happen. I think that not all the time, but oftentimes we just kind of stretch too much. Certain parts of our body, and we do that every day, and we continue to do that for years and years, and that starts to turn into these repetitive injuries. And then I think strength training is the perfect medicine for that, because it's totally different. So it's going to give our body this different stimulus, which is what we need for repetitive strain injuries. We need to just do something different. We need to not do the same repeating movement over and over and over again. And then strength training also helps to just bring that buoyancy back into our tissues. Muscles love to be loaded. They respond very well to certain levels of load. Fascia also responds pretty well to levels of load, and the body through this load can start to adapt. And then it's really the adaptation we're looking for, especially if something is not functioning very well or it's giving us pain. I also think that strength training is so great for repetitive stuff because strength training is so vast. There's so much to choose from. Like I said, it could be anything from Pilates exercises to isolated, more bodybuilding type lifting. It could be body weight stuff. You could be doing squats and push-ups. It can be more dynamic movement. Some people will start to go more into jumping and plyometrics eventually. It's there's just so much to choose from that it just provides us with a whole new tool belt to pull from. And when we're dealing with repetitive strain, I think we just need to have this variation. We just need to change things up. And then oftentimes the repetitive strain goes away.
So for a yoga teacher who's feeling like they want to start to bring some of this in, I mean, first of all, when you say there's so much available out there, I kind of feel like an overwhelm of where would I know to start? You know, where would you guide a teacher? Would you say, like, take a training, take this training, or start bringing it into your classes this way? Where would you tell teachers?
Well, so when I started, I was having lower back pain, sacrum issues. I was having knee problems. And I don't think I started the best way, but I basically started by like going for a run. I started running 3, 4, 5 kilometers. And then I finally realized okay, this isn't really fixing my problems. I should go see someone. So I signed up kind of like fluke. I ended up in this workshop with this internationally renowned teacher. And even just having a little bit of that guidance from him, spending just a couple of days together, was enough to now kickstart the next couple years of my training. I think that taking some sort of course or weekend or certification or whatever you want to call it can be a really helpful first step just to get the ball rolling. But at the same time, it's really hard to choose, because if you Google whatever strength training workshop or seminar, you're going to get 1,000 different things. And I think for most yoga teachers, at least from the outside, those types of workshops do not really look appealing. Another kind of good, interesting way to start is, I think probably most of us have a friend who's a personal trainer. And I think unless you're dealing with some major injuries, specialty stuff, working with a personal trainer, even just with very simple movements, can be a helpful first way to start. And if people really just cannot work with someone else for whatever reason, just starting to work on a couple movements by yourself will be helpful. So, setting yourself a goal of I'm going to really learn how to squat, and I'm going to learn how to do it well. And if you go to YouTube, you're going to find all of these videos on squatting, and there's different resources available. And some of them are really, really good. There's a lot of amazing information, in books, in tutorials, kind of at our fingertips that we can then experiment with in our own practices. And I think as long as we're not lifting big weights, and we're not putting our bodies at risk, and we're not doing things that are, above and beyond the spectrum of functional movement, then, we don't have to worry too much about injuring ourselves. But if we're already coming into this from a perspective of injury, I would recommend, trying to see someone at least a couple times just to get the ball rolling, just to get some basic information. Lots of people have insurance, and so then they can go see a physiotherapist. And if your physiotherapist is really good, they'll probably be connected with either some specific classes, or they might be able to give people an idea of where to begin. Because you're right, it's so broad, it's so vast, there's so many movements to choose from. How do we know where to even start?
Yeah.
And I think that if people are coming at this from the not injured perspective, then just trying some things on your own, might not hurt, as long as you're not doing it every day. So we don't want to just trade one type of repetitive thing for another. We want to make sure that it really is well-rounded, and it really is balanced.
What a great point. To not have the same thing going in the opposite direction. So you might switch out yoga and then do strength training. And then if you're doing exactly the same thing, repetitive movement, it's not going to serve the body. That's so good. It's also, I like how you said, bring this into your own practice first. So that's a great tool for teachers. I know that we do that all the time in the yoga that we teach, or it just feels so much different if you're teaching a pose from a real place of experience. So that's also a great tip.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that part of it is really key, especially like when we're integrating new things into our own practices. Like I posted a video on the internet a couple weeks ago, and then my mom messaged me later that night, and she was like, "Oh my God, I was like at this class in the change room, and the couple of teachers were already talking about how they're like teaching your exercises from the video." And on the one hand, it's so great because, the word is spreading, and that's fabulous. But on the other hand, it's like sometimes I think it's good to, practice these things for a few months, get some, feedback from your own body about them before we start teaching, because I think having that like extra little bit of experience can really help us teach our students in a way that's more beneficial.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so if teachers wanted to work with you, if they felt like, okay, I want to bring this in and I'm not sure how, what are some of the ways that they could work with you?
It really depends where they're located. So I teach workshops kind of all over Canada at different times of the year. Like next week, I'm going to Halifax for a weekend. Then I've got a weekend in St. John's. I do a weekend at the end of May in Toronto. I've got some plans to go back to the West Coast. So, there are options. I lead a workshop in Cornwall every year. If students are, really far away or in a different country, online courses are a great way to learn. And I have 2 new online courses coming out in a matter of weeks, which is
Really?
really exciting.
Tell us about those.
Yeah, so I launched an upper body strength for handstands online course a few months ago, and I had a group and we went through it together. And then since then, I've made some adjustments to the format of the course. And basically, it's just a really great way to learn quality content, quality material at your own speed, totally at your own pace. So things that are included in the online course are professionally shot videos, which outline, how to do different exercises. And then people also receive a written out PDF, which has all the details of the exercises and maybe who should not do these exercises, what are common concerns of these movements, stuff like that. And also included in that is workout or practice plans that people can follow. And I think that that's, one of the most helpful parts of the online course is it's not just like, okay, I'm throwing these exercises at you. It's having an actual game plan for how to use these movements and exercises in your own practice. And then that can start to translate into your teaching. So the upper body course is coming back. And then I also have a mindful strength online course that is coming up shortly. So if people want info on that, they should just join my community on my website.
Very cool. We will put a link to your website for sure in the show notes. I love it that you're doing online training, but because I feel like that, I'm 3 hours from Toronto and I love to go and eat great food and have some culture, but it's still 3-hour drive. So thanks for bringing that online.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Tell us about the mindful part of this. So you said that the next one coming up is mindful. So is this what you were saying before, that people go to your strength classes, but it's in a mindful way, or it's kind of yoga-like?
Yeah, so what I'm kind of calling the way that I teach now is I'm calling it mindful strength. So most of my weekend programs are mindful strength courses. Basically, this is taking the physical movement part of strength training, making it feel more like a yoga practice. So we still start out really slowly. Oftentimes my classes begin lying down on the back or standing, doing something very simple just to kind of let everybody bring their attention to what they're doing. And we also end with 5 or 10 minutes of lying down in something that would look like a corpse pose. The other part of it is just using really basic kind of somatic awareness to continue to bring the attention to what we're doing, to the body, and also using that to help fine-tune our movement. So something that I focus on a lot in the more mindful part of strength training is, so say we're doing an exercise for our glutes. And I'll instruct people to, contract your glutes, do this exercise, but then I'll also instruct people to like notice what's actually happening. Because how frequently are we doing an exercise for one particular reason, but all we're feeling is pain in our lower back, or we're clenching up our teeth, or we're feeling something else. And so and if we continue to do the exercise in that way, it will never actually serve us. Like it's never actually going to make our glutes stronger if we're just crunching our lower back every time, or if we're just creating tension in our necks every time. And so part of the practice is to yes, do the movement, yes, do the exercise, but then really tuning in and noticing what you feel. And if you don't actually feel your glutes contracting during that specific exercise, make a modification, move your foot a little bit, change something about how you're doing the pose or the movement to make it more beneficial for your own body, and really respecting that everybody's going to be a little bit different. Some people, are going to want to do an exercise with one specific alignment, while other people will want to make a small change. And so just giving a little bit of space in the class for that. And also what I found is continuing to bring this more mindful somatic awareness to the practice as it leaves people feeling really relaxed at the end of it all. So rather than coming into class, and usually strength is very invigorating and can make us very tired, and it's very much just do the reps and don't care about how they look, just do 10 reps and get it done. And I try to kind of leave that element of it out of my classes as much as possible. Just to allow people to, at the end of it all, feel downregulated and not feel like they've been crushed by the movement, or not feel just that whole idea of no pain, no gain. I'm going to the gym, I'm going to get crushed by these exercises. I try to avoid that as much as I can.
Right.
So that's kind of where the more mindful element comes in.
What a gift for people, because that's why I feel like I avoid anything, kind of those kind of classes, because I wouldn't want to leave that. And I think also, there must be something in this parasympathetic, sympathetic nervous system. That's why I really love doing yoga. And so if I could do strength training with that awareness. I love how you call it mindful strength. That is such a gift. Thank you for offering that. And I'm excited to learn more for sure. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Is there anything else that you would kind of share with teachers if they want to bring in more strength training, or if they, what's a common question that you hear from teachers most often, or where is the struggle for them?
I think that a lot of people are sometimes confused about how to actually get these exercises into the sequence of a yoga class. And I think that that's really valid. My main piece of advice is to add a little bit of strength into the warm-up. So this can be a really hard shift for students. If students are used to going to a yoga, air quotes, yoga class, and then they show up and the teacher's actually, we're doing push-ups today and we're not going to do any yoga poses. Students can become angry and then not go back to your class. And so that's a problem for the yoga teacher. I think that if this is new to you and it's new to your students and you're just finding small ways to slip it in there, is to just add it at the beginning and frame it as well, this is part of our warm-up today. So we're going to do some external rotation exercises, and this is how we're going to warm up our shoulders, or we're going to do some squatting, we're going to do some heel raises, or we're going to do some, glute exercises. And I think that it's a really good way to warm up. I think that that's the preferred warm up, and also a really good way to get people focused and to get people to have an experience right off the bat, and have something very tangible to tie their attention to, which for some students will be helpful to get centered. And I think that, when I first started doing these things, that's what it looked like. It looked like just, 10 minutes of wrist strength at the beginning of the class, 10 minutes of this at the beginning of the class, or that. And then gradually I started to add, okay, well, what if we do 10 minutes of hip extension work before we do our back bends? Maybe that'll make our students' back bends feel better, make the glutes and the hamstrings contract better. And gradually, at least in my experience, students started to come up to me and they said things like, wow, like that wrist strength right at the beginning of the class made my sun salutations feel a lot better. And I think that gradually people will start to come around. But if we just, give people a full plate all at once, it's too much, because they think they're going to yoga, as ridiculous as like these labels are, this is what's happening right now.
Right.
In the real life of the yoga studio.
I'm curious then, when you started introducing this to your students, did they all stick with you and move in this transition?
In my experience, most of them did. I'm sure some of them dropped off, but when I started adding strength into my yoga classes, like I taught at a busy downtown Toronto studio, I definitely didn't feel that there was a drop off in the numbers of people who were coming to my classes. It was really it was a slow build. It was 10 minutes at a time. And so I think if people looked back now, they would say oh, wow, this is just, continued to snowball into where now there's, very little traditional yoga poses and pretty much all strength stuff.
Right.
And mobility, because mobility is really important as well. But I know lots of teachers who have had a hard time with that, who have had a hard time with keeping their yoga students motivated and interesting when their own particular interests have been changing. I know that my mom has really felt this, and it can be really difficult, and it's hard for the yoga teacher to maintain their job while maybe their interests are starting to change, and these are all things that we have to take into consideration.
That's so true. If it stops being your thing and your passion, it shows up. I don't know how, but I see this in my own classes, because even right now I'm really passionate about teaching yoga for pelvic health. And I tried to throw in another one thinking that maybe students are getting sick of that. And nope, my numbers were way lower. So I love that you say, that we can slowly build this in, and it can be a part of, our yoga class, and it doesn't have to be the whole thing. That's so amazing. And I think it's so needed right now as well. One other question I wanted to ask you is, do you tell students, so say they're beginner students and they're coming to your class, what do you call your class?
Well, this is funny. So when I moved to Cornwall almost 2 years ago, I started my own business and I called it Cornwall Yoga Studio. And on my schedule, of course, it says yoga class and Pilates and this and that. And it's really funny because people come to class and they're like, I've never done this before. I'm a beginner. I've never done yoga. I'm like, you're going to be just fine. They come into the class. They do the movements. Although my class is built around strength, it's very simple. It's very basic. It's not like now we're doing 50 squats. It's very much a slow build. So I have not gotten any resistance or feedback of that sort, but I also, I don't change the name of my business now because it's already rolling. There's already momentum.
Right.
But it's I don't think it really needs to be called a yoga studio. It looks like a yoga studio. It's nice and it's clean and there's blocks and I have a diffuser, but
I love it. I love that then made it yoga.
We don't really do a lot of yoga poses. I had a very funny experience where this woman who had never ever done yoga before started coming to my class, and she was very skeptical of yoga because she has a very strong Christian belief practice, and she teaches at the church, and she's very involved in that community, which is really common in this small town where I live. And so she was not sure if yoga would be a good fit for her based on what she had previously heard. So she started coming to my classes, and she realized she loved it and it was going to be a perfect fit. And I think part of why it was such a good fit was because it was just very neutral, and it was down regulating and relaxing in a way that a yoga class would be, but it didn't feel like it was in conflict with any other types of her spiritual practice that she's very dedicated to. And then she went away on vacation for a few months, and she said, I'm thinking about going to a yoga class. I said, you should do it. Just like, go see what else is out there. Because she has not been exposed to anything except for my classes, which she thinks is yoga.
Right.
She came back after a few months. She's like, Kathryn, like, what kind of yoga are you doing? She's like, because you're not doing what everybody else out there is doing. I'm like, ha ha ha. And like, now people are going to start to see. I'm like, this is such a funny dynamic at my studio, because most people who I teach have never done yoga before. And because it's such a small town, nobody knows what yoga is. Like, there is no baseline. It's just like, it's such a funny dynamic for me, because I'm from Toronto, where yoga is like such a defined thing. And I realized that it's just not like that.
Maybe then it's easier, because you're kind of saying, this is my yoga. And, you know, I had a student come up to me not too long ago and say, how would I find another class like yours? And I thought, I don't know. You know, it's really what shapes us. You said that, you know, your experience in your body, and then the different trainings that you took, and the things that you continue to learn and research, that's what makes your yoga practice. And no one can replicate that. That's a really good message for teachers as well, that when you really tap into something, you know, you're saying, this is different than all of the other yoga out there. And, you know, if someone wanted to be bendy, stretchy, they're probably going to go to your class and say, this isn't for me. I really wanted to put my foot behind my head.
Exactly.
Right? So you also say, you know, this class isn't for you to some part of the population, but it sounds like it's working really well.
Yeah. And especially in this type of setting.
What a gift. Well, thank you so much for all that you've shared today. If you have any favorite books or favorite articles that you think, you know what, teachers, if you want to start somewhere, start here, you can let us know.
Oh my goodness.
Put you on the spot there, didn't I?
So there's a lot. So when I started strength training, I mentioned that I went to one certification program in particular.
Oh yeah, who was that with?
And it was taught by a man named Ido Portal. He's like a kind of a sensation at this point. When I first took those workshops with him, they were tiny workshops. They were like not sold out. And now he teaches all over the world. And I don't think his workshops are like the most accessible, but even to just kind of look from the outside at what he's doing, what his students are doing, is pretty incredible. Definitely not beginner level, but pretty incredible, pretty inspiring. So he was the person who got me started off. So I always, like to credit him, because I think he's really fantastic. These days, what I'm really focused on is I'm taking the somatic experiencing training program, which is a very kind of intense trauma course. And, anything that comes from Peter Levine, anything that comes from Bessel van der Kolk, their books, their research is what's really inspiring me these days. And that's also how I've built up kind of like the mindful aspect of the mindful strength. A lot of their research has really shifted the way that I teach.
This is fantastic. We had Margaret Howard talk with us in episode 3 about trauma, and specifically in yoga. So that's great that you're bringing that in. Because that's what I would think would be missing if I went to the gym, worked with Yeah.
I think in most cases that is exactly what's missing from the strength stuff. And it's really hard. I mean, I've had experiences myself, like going to a strength workshop, going to different types of seminars, and being like extremely triggered by the whole experience. Doing the trauma training has really helped me like make my teaching more well-rounded, make my everything, compassion and just own practice, more well-rounded. But that's really, I think, what the missing link is for gym settings in general.
And then do you lead a teacher training?
Yeah, so I lead a small teacher training in Cornwall where I live at my little studio. I also I co-founded a teacher training program called Yoga Detour in Toronto, and I commute to Toronto a few times a year to teach as a faculty member on that program. Sometimes when my mom is leading a teacher training program, I go do a workshop for her. I'm on the Amara Vidya faculty. There's another studio in Kitchener just hired me to be on the faculty.
Okay.
So it's a little bit wide right now.
That's what I was thinking, that this will be so good if other teachers are getting this and bringing this in. If this is what really speaks to people, then they can take a teacher training with you. That's fantastic.
Yeah. And I'm looking, this is my major long-term goal, is to put my mindful strength teacher training program online.
Ooh.
Which is seems a little crazy.
No,
to
it
even
doesn't
say
seem crazy. It seems
point,
really
but
exciting. And I've been waiting for a yoga teacher to see, I'm sure it can be done. And I think this day and age, it really can. I know there's hesitation. There's hesitation in me and in general in the community, but I think it's really needed. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Let us know when that happens for sure.
Yeah. Join the newsletter.
Well, it's so fun to talk to a yoga teacher from Ontario, Canada today. And I will be sure to put all of the links here for our yoga teachers. Thank you so much for your time today, Kathryn. Connected Yoga Teachers.
Thanks for having me.
Lots
It's really my
of
pleasure.
amazing information from Kathryn. I'm excited to say that after this interview, I started to look at my own yoga practice again and see if I could add in some strengthening, a little bit more, and a little change of pace. And I am absolutely loving it. So thank you for that inspiration, Kathryn. For those of you who would like to work with Kathryn, all of the links to contact her are in the show notes. So just go to the connectedyogateacher.com website and look for this episode. Also, you will find a link to Kathryn's new podcast. Congratulations, Kathryn. She just launched this podcast in July, I want to say, of this year, and I'm super excited. I've listened to little snippets of it because I just found out about it this week, and I'm so excited to have another yoga podcast to listen to. So I'll put a link for that in the show notes. Also, I wanted to tell you guys that Kathryn was recently in a Yoga Journal article. It was titled The Future of Yoga, 15 Millennial Yoga Teachers to Watch. And Yoga Journal wrote, as the yoga community continues to transform, we look to the next generation of leaders for clues about what's next. These 15 rock star teachers, all age 30 or under, have their mudras on the pulse of the millennial yoga scene. So thank you so much to Yoga Journal for this really great article. I loved clicking through and seeing what different yoga teachers are doing. If there's one key takeaway for me in this entire episode, it's that Kathryn really took something that she loved and she took something that she was passionate about and that she learned about in her own body, in her own way, and she's taking it out into the world in a new way. So she's not calling herself, as far as I can see, a yoga teacher. Yet, as she said, she does when she speaks with certain groups of people. So I think that we can start to step out of sort of the boxes that we put ourselves into, the categories, the lineage that you're in, do you teach in a studio or a gym, and just start to step back from all of those boxes that we tend to put on ourselves and look at what is really my yoga, what is my expression of this. I do have an ongoing dialogue kind of question in my head when we start to pull in other modalities into yoga. Are we watering it down? My thought on this is that I see yoga as this continuous, fluid, evolving practice. And there are things that we've drawn on from many different modalities that add to be what yoga is now. So I would love to hear your thoughts on that. And I'm also very much open to you telling me, no, Shannon, that's not the way I feel. I feel this way about yoga. So I invite you to either send me an email or click on the leave a voicemail button. It's on the Connected Yoga Teacher page. And I think that's how we're going to close out today, is with a voicemail from Lisa with some really fantastic feedback. So thank you for that, Lisa.
Hi, Shannon. My name is Lisa Zeringer, and I discovered you about 2 months ago, and I'm so glad I did. The Connected Yoga Teacher platform you've created has been such an invaluable resource for me. I feel like finding you has been this kind of like discovering this really rare, precious gem in this vast yogic sea. The space you've created is inspiring, authentic, and wholehearted. I feel really safe there.
Take care, Connected Yoga Teachers.
So wonderful what
Stay
you've done.
connected to yourself, your practice, your community. Namaste.